Now, I'm not here to introduce this first afternoon session. This first afternoon session is really on the art of persuasion, or the skills and techniques of persuasive communications. We've just had an election in the UK in which the parties were trying to persuade us to vote for them, and they all, for the first time in the known history of all elections, they all managed to lose the election. So it wasn't very successful. We have one of Britain's best political commentators to moderate this next session. Matthew d'Ancona, who has moderated here before. Matthew, in fact, gets a prize as the most interesting moderator of all your sessions. Not only is he a great political writer for the Sunday Telegraph, GQ, and the Evening Standard, currently working on a history of England with John Cleese. Now, that isn't, if that doesn't make him more interesting than folks like me, nothing will. So I'm going to introduce Matthew d'Ancona, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Evan. It's very kind, and I'm not sure I can live up to that, but I will do my best. No Monty Python jokes. But what I do have this afternoon is a terrific panel for you to discuss the art of persuasion, three true legends in this area. So please join me in welcoming on stage Sir John Hegarty, Philip Gould, and Alan Edwards. I think, there we go. Now, the purpose of this afternoon session really is to try and look at the ways in which an idea or a product or a person can be sold to the wider world. And I think we couldn't really ask for a better lineup of panelists. Alan Edwards in the middle is the CEO of the Outside organisation and possibly the most knowledgeable man on pop music in the universe. A great man in that world and many others. Philip Gould, many of you will know as the man who actually was responsible for an earlier realignment of politics. He really is one of my personal heroes, someone who totally changed the face of political communications and political strategy, and his book, The Unfinished Revolution, is more than a manual to how to take a party from opposition to power, but he's much else besides that, and is now Vice Chair of Freud Communications. And on my left is John Hegarty, who's the Worldwide Creative Director of Bartle, Bogle and Hegarty, and himself a man who has led an extraordinarily distinguished life in advertising and continues to do so, having won a string of awards and garlands through his career. And I'd like, without further ado, to start by asking you, John, I mean, how do you think we live in a world, and in a sense, the whole of this gathering is underpinned by a presumption that we live in a world where technology and the communications methods are changing. How has that changed the difficulty and perhaps the opportunities of how an idea can be sold to the public, how people can be persuaded of it?
Well, I think, I mean, the first thing to say is that we've always lived in an evolving technological world. I came into advertising so long ago, I don't really like to talk about it, but the television commercial was developed in about 1955, and it was the most momentous change in terms of communication that we had ever experienced. In the 60s came along colour magazines. Colour magazines, I mean, they now look as though they're everywhere and they're a commonplace, but at the time, the Sunday Times colour magazine was a phenomenal change. So, in a sense, we've always been living with technology, and technology is fundamental to creative expression. Without technology, you can't express an idea. You know, a paintbrush was the most fantastic development for an artist, because all of a sudden I could paint an interesting picture. But I think today what we're seeing is monumental change. And I personally think and I make this speech about, this is probably the most exciting time to be in advertising and communication. Just because the tools at your disposal now are so phenomenal, so incredible, that ideas can be transmitted in a way which was unheard of 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So for me, personally, this is an incredibly exciting time. A time where if creativity learns to embrace technology and understand it's always been an ally, then our industry, the communications industry, has a fantastic future.
But Don Tapscott yesterday was talking about the ways in which the customer has changed, the punter. How does that affect the methods that you use to get your message across, the people you're actually reaching? Not just the technology at your disposal, but the methods you use when you employ that technology.
Well, you tend now to have, communication used to be in bursts. And what you have now is a situation where it's a continuous dialogue. And this puts great demands upon our clients and people wishing to communicate, because it requires an openness, and it requires trust, and it requires honesty. Now, all of those are very dangerous words in the world of communication. But in many ways, all the great communication ideas have employed those elements of openness, truth, and trust. But now, today, you've got to be constantly in control. You've got to be prepared to let go. You've got to be prepared to let your
How do you know when to let go?
Well, I think you're always in the process of letting go, because my great belief is always that brands, there's a great thing today where people think the way advertising should work or communication work is understand what your consumers want and then give it to them. That's one way of doing it. Read the consumer's mind. I've always believed it's about inspiring the consumer. The consumer doesn't actually know necessarily what they want. Inspire them to come to you. And if you do that, you're in a much better place. You're in a much more interesting place, and people want to constantly have a dialogue with you.
Because you're talking there about a communications culture which is not just responsive, but proactive. So how do you in an organisation, and for the people who are here, what advice can you give them for creating that sort of internal culture at their organisations that will be proactive and not just what do the punters think, but how can we assist them in becoming to like what we are selling?
Well, the first thing, again, what you have to do there is you have to look at what you're selling. What are we selling? Are we selling something of value? Somebody once said, make something daring and say it in a daring way, or make something interesting and say it in a daring way. And a huge number of brands that you look at around the world, and that you look at, that sometimes we're asked to comment on, really have very little value. They're maintained by myth, and they're maintained by sort of smokescreen. So the first thing is have something interesting to sell, and then communicate that in a daring way. And I think then you engage with people.
Alan, you're CEO of the Outside organisation, and you work with some of the best known people on the planet. How has it changed that role? I mean, it must have, when you started, I imagine that in some respects it was a very straightforward task. But what now are the key priorities for you?
It's changed a lot, and it hasn't. I mean, when I first started, there were about 2 or 3 music papers. There was very few radio stations, and I remember really it all stopped at Dover. It was very simple, and you rang up papers and you told the story and you were a narrator. And then we arrive at the current sort of position where the technology is incredible. There's an amazing amount of things happening. It is 24-hour. You need that extraordinary speed of reaction. And you've got a lot more tools at your disposal. And you've obviously got, the media is now probably 50 times the size it was then. It is quite... But what I think, in some ways, that benefits takes you back to square one, because you still need someone to show you through it. You still need someone to be a guiding light. And I think in many respects, that benefits the classic PR. I think a lot of the stories that we've seen this year in the media, you'll often find that there's a real traditional PR behind it, because the disciplines and skills are still the same. It's, can you tell a good story? Can you pitch it well? Can you respond quickly? So I think in some ways PR is going through a great period, and in a lot of respects it's a rebirth to the original, the original operators.
I mean, lots of the people you deal with, with celebrity naturally comes controversy. So your job, I suppose, disproportionately will involve what might be called crisis management.
Yeah.
Now, what sort of advice do you have on crisis management? Is speed the key, or authenticity, or trust? I mean, how do you take a problem and make it less of a problem?
Well, you have to tackle it head on. You have to do it very, very quickly. You have to be you know, reasonably honest, because you have to be transparent now because everyone can find out. And if you do, you know, if you're ambiguous, if you prevaricate, that's when problems come in. And I mean, there's many, many examples of that. Tiger Woods, if he'd been more sort of open about the situation, although obviously in his case, with the sort of industrial scale of what he was up to, might have been tricky. But you know, if you look at the John Terry scenario, where the allegations were made about his private life, and that was pretty tricky, it was kind of confronted and dealt with very, very quickly. And within a few days, there were lots of sort of set up pictures of Terry with her outdoors by a swimming pool in Dubai, and the story passed quickly. So it was confronted. I mean, the Avram Grant one wasn't too bad either. You know, you may recall he was called out in allegedly called out in a massage parlour in Portsmouth or whatever, and there was a controversy there. And his wife came steaming into the rescue with a great line, which also introduced a bit of humour to the situation, which can be a great way of deflating a crisis. And she said, with all the stress he was under at Portsmouth, she absolutely agreed that he should have a massage every day. In fact, he should have 2. And it was absolutely brilliant. I mean, if we can hire her, we will, because the story stopped dead that day. I mean, that was it. And it was treated with mild amusement, and that was the thing. I mean, another one that stuck in my mind was a couple of years back, Richard Branson. There was a train crash, I think, over the Christmas period. It was an unfortunate crash. I think someone was killed. But Branson was there on site within 2 hours in the wind sheet, you know, the hair sweat, talking to people. It took control of the situation. Very much a hands-on CEO, not sunning himself on some Caribbean island. Bit ironic, but he was there. He took control. He was honest. He didn't try and hide behind anything. And he took it directly, and in anything, he turned a PR loss into a PR victory. One which didn't work was another example, the flip side. Sir John Brown, who was the BP chairman, he got caught up in a whole controversy about his sexuality, which actually was a lot of fuss about nothing, and should have just really been any normal, practiced, experienced PR would have just said, look, let's just deal with it, let's make a clean breast of it and get on with it, and it would have passed, because it was really a non-story. But unfortunately, he didn't really deal with it. I think there was probably a lot of people advising him on process, and days became weeks, and you know, eventually it cost a very able man his job. So it's really back to the basics, confront the problem quickly, be as honest as you sensibly can, obviously put a spin on it. If it's one particular media source, you might want to try and do a deal to limit the damage.
Well,
so
that's an interesting question.
Dark arts.
Because obviously, you know, having been a newspaper executive in the past, I know, you know, your name is highly regarded in that industry, and there was a few newspaper editors would not have taken your call,
yep.
Okay? But now there are tens of thousands of gossip sheets out there, and online, and they are viral, and things fly around by email in seconds, parsecs. Who do you call when something breaks online? In your shoes now, who do you call? How do you get out a sort of counter-viral suggestion? Or do you not bother?
Well, I think one thing is that, you know, you asked me about the differences in PR in the early days and PR now. When I was working for a guy called Keith Altham, who represented practically everybody who was at Woodstock, from Hendrix to the Stones, whatever, the entire organisation consisted of Keith, a French girl who came in a couple of days to do the books, and myself, and 3 telephone lines. And we handled probably 20 international rock stars. You couldn't do that now. You need a team, you need a machine, you need to be watching online, you need to be watching Twitter, you need to be watching this, that, and the other. And the trick, the real skill now, is to combine that sort of, if you like, that watching brief, that machine, but also with an individual who can get in and tackle the problem. So in answer to your question, if it's on a website, you've got to be on there pretty quick. Often you've got to threaten legal action to get it taken down straight away.
Does that work?
Yeah, but it's not always fast enough. Yeah. So you've then got to go very, very quickly to the next source, which could be the Sky or the Daily Express or whatever it is, and say, look, there's already, this story's floating around, we've already taken action, it was a load of bunkum, let's move on. And if you do that quickly enough, and within hours, you can often put the fire out before it ever catches.
Philip, you...
I think you should have been Gordon Brown's agent. That's the conclusion I'd come from this.
The subject did come up once.
Yeah, the product was flawed, though, wasn't it? So.
Exactly, the brand is what counts.
Well, there's no need to go so far, is there?
Philip, you've
Yes?
you've watched brands of all types, including the Gordon Brown brand, ebb and flow, shall we say, over the years. Again, looking at the punters, how has their behaviour, how have their assumptions changed in the years?
Completely changed. I mean, political consultancy started really in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and the idea was using scientific analysis in order to influence opinion. That was the kind of idea, and the idea was essentially that you found out what people think, just what John was saying, and you give it back to them. That's the model. And that model led to a degree of alienation and a degree of disenchantment and a degree of, frankly, hostility to politics that this was not feasible. And so going into this election, there was so much hostility to politics. I have never known it before in my life. And I've been doing this for 6 years. 6 elections, I mean. 6 elections I've done. Won 3, lost 2, and 1 score draw, which is how I describe this one. Not quite fair, I know. And
the other side win on penalties.
I think we're playing extra time. Basically, the transformation in the electorate has been extraordinary. I mean, I've been doing focus groups all the way through, and suddenly in the last 2 or 3 weeks, the level of empowerment, the level of interest, the level of engagement is phenomenal. And I'm not just exaggerating, that is true. Mostly because of the television debates, because the television debates kind of cut the media out of it and just enable people to see unmediated discussion, which was important. Also, free parties, that froze their brains. Suddenly, what? Free parties? And that was like a disruptive moment, and that led to a different concept of choice that was intriguing. And also the internet, because although the internet was never mentioned, they were all, not your kind of nerdy Hampstead set, but perfectly straightforward, ordinary housewives in Basildon. Everyone was on the internet and using the internet as an empowering, big factor in this election.
Right, so the idea that somehow the internet is the preserve of an elite,
no,
that's wrong.
No, completely wrong. So that was all happening. But at the same time as that, so everything changed in a way. This was honestly, I've never known such enthusiasm for politics in my life. But the share of vote didn't change. And I think the share of vote didn't change was because the 2 opposition leaders were trapped in a paradigm of persuasion, which was articulation and words and words and words. And it wasn't enough. And the better they got, the more articulate they got, people just said no.
But that's interesting because one of New Labour's greatest achievements was to colonise whole swathes of language. You know, good words like prosperity and affluence and aspiration and so on became the preserve of New Labour.
But that you're saying that's changed. Tony Blair, for the entire time, was making changes that backed up his language.
Yeah.
And so what they felt about David Cameron, he did a faultless campaign, I really feel that. But they just felt it's words. And his chance to make the difference was earlier. And what was needed was substance to build up the words. And words are not enough. You've got to have substance, you've got to have real change. And that was the lesson, I think, of the election campaign. Because I've done groups since the election. They said, look, yeah, it was fantastic, David Cameron, but I didn't trust him. I think the real lesson of this election is that communications is no longer about people like us persuading people like them about what is the right thing to do. It is people like them saying, we'll make up our own minds. We will discover what is true and what is not true, and we will be the author of our destiny. And so I think you have moved really to an empowerment model.
But you have spoken in the past that the wisdom of crowds has to be matched by the wisdom of leadership.
That's true, yeah.
Right? Well, at what point does that come? Because that seems to me the crux of what you just said. Okay, these are people who are now, they're working on the basis of peer-to-peer recommendation as much as they are receiving a message from on high. But at what point and how do you, as the brand representative, intervene and say, actually, this is what's right, this is what you should think about this brand?
Well, I think that the essence of modern, I think leadership is more and more and more important. I think leading in this world is just hugely important, and I think that it's a hard and difficult task, difficult task for Gordon Brown and for President Obama and also for David Cameron in the future. But you kind of have to balance the power and the insight and the wisdom of the crowds, because they saw through all of the parties perfectly with the need to lead. And that is actually, I think, the essential task of leadership. It's the wisdom of the crowd and the wisdom of the leader have to connect in a way that gets you progress. And you can go so far ahead of the crowd and you will be okay. If you go too far ahead, you will not be. But and I think President Obama does this well at the moment, actually. I think he didn't for a while, but he does now. You have to lead your nation, but you have to listen to your nation, and you have to do the same thing at the same time. And that is hugely hard. It is a multi-tasking quality task, leadership, and very, very hard indeed. But you have to match the both. But leadership is so important to me.
John, you're nodding. I mean, do you see that there are parallels between the political things that Philip is talking about and the broader world of persuasion?
Absolutely, except, I mean, I agree with most of what Philip's saying there, except that I don't believe that, I mean, I think Cameron failed because he didn't inspire anybody. He was all the packaging without any of the content. And we've spent our lives working.
The sound carping.
Yeah, but we well, it was
you can say it now.
You can say it now.
I don't believe
that. I spent my life in advertising, and we spent our lives trying to go into brands that you've got to stand for something, you've got to believe in something, you've got to offer something, and then talk about that. And there's always been this belief that somehow the communications industry is a way of masking what's true, masking the reality of a brand. And in actual fact, if you look at all the great successes, you look at all the brands, the companies, the business that have done well, is that they've had something profoundly interesting to sell, and they've talked about it in an interesting way. And I think the Obama campaign worked, because when he got up and said, change, yes we can, he looked like change. David Cameron gets up and says, change. He's an old Etonian, surrounded by old Etonians, and you look at it and you go, it's not change.
It's not an old Etonian.
But John,
no, but it's not the point.
That's the point, though,
that's
isn't
the
it?
brand.
Not everyone in the team is an old Etonian. I mean, Alan's
how
right.
many of them were? A high percentage of them were. 13 out of
well under 20%.
You know, I mean, so when you said change, you know, what they didn't talk about was something that was true, that you could believe in, and I think that's why he failed.
Supply evidence for change is what I think.
Right. But Alan,
I think that is the key thing, and I think he had to have done that earlier. And I think the moment he had not done that, words just became words.
Alan, can I just bring you back in on that whole point about authenticity? How important is that?
It's the emotional connection, isn't it? I mean, that's the key. That's where, I mean, we talked about Obama, and if you go back to Bill Clinton, he was a master at it, absolutely incredible. And he made considered one of the most important advertising campaigns in America politically, where he did a thing about a town called Hope, and he took him back to this little beautiful old railway station, a little old house, and the town was called Hope, and this is where I started. And
but it wouldn't have worked if it wasn't real. I mean,
it was genuine. It was him. So it is authenticity. And by the way, just one point Philip made earlier on about leadership. That's the sort of, you know, that is PR. You're listening to your client and you're leading them at the same time, and it's quite a hard balance. And you do need leaders. You need absolute leaders in the world, but you need leaders in business. You need leaders in PR especially, because there's an awful lot of agencies, in my view, that go out there and they fire emails off like First World War journals, you know, over the sort of trenches, and it has meaningless effect.
That doesn't constitute leadership, then?
That's not leadership. That's process.
So what is leadership then in the Web 2.0 world?
It's someone that can make a decision and still, in this day and age, going back to how it's changed, still pick up the telephone, go and have a glass of wine with someone, do something, interact with them directly, immediately. And that's very, very important. And those principles get lost. And I think they got lost a lot in the late 90s, the last 10 years. But we've now had we're now having a return of the storyteller, return of the proper PR. And it actually benefits those with experience, those with contacts, and those with the, ability, courage to make decisions. So leadership's absolutely crucial. I mean, I hope that we're going to enter a period now where leadership becomes more important, because we do need to see more entrepreneurs, more leaders in all kinds of formats.
Are there any questions people would like to ask of this distinguished panel? While you're thinking of your brilliant questions, because we've only got about 5 minutes left, I mean, I want to just go back to Philip and ask, just to sort of tease out a bit of that, what lessons there are from your political work that can be transplanted to some of the businesses that are represented by the people in the room. I mean, what can they take away from your political life into their commercial life?
I think that the more we enter an electronic age, the more information that is available, the more citizens and consumers use the internet, the less we should be thinking about meeting the immediate demands and immediate desires, the more we should be thinking about getting the fundamentals and the substance right. And I think the citizens and consumers both want substance. They want real proof points. They want real evidence of change. They want the fundamentals. And I think that there's this paradox going on. We live in an immediate world, but we live in a world where people are looking for the deeper, the more serious, and the more fundamental. I think that is the biggest lesson, indeed, from politics.
So in a sense, the communication strategy cannot be a bolt-on extra.
No, I mean, our strategy was...
It must run through the whole creative process.
Our strategy was the victory of substance over style. Now, it didn't quite work out like that, but it was kind of like that was where we were, anyway. I mean, you just kind of... We went for substance against these two guys.
And I mean, that's a good question. I mean, you raise a good question, because not Flash, just Gordon, was hailed as a great slogan. This is what the public want. They want authenticity, granite, not plastic, all that. And yet, in the end, the two people that are running the country are ultimately, the style guys, aren't they? The style
Well, they
twins,
are the style guys.
The style council.
Clegg, they are the style council, and I think I think you should put that in your column next week. I think that Nick Clegg got less seats than last time, and David Cameron, who ran I agree, an excellent campaign, failed to get a majority, which is quite staggering in this circumstance. So style didn't carry them there.
Yeah. Well,
and it will not carry businesses there either.
But what I'm trying to tease out here is not really just with reference to Brown, but people always talk about getting back to reality and authenticity and the real thing. But often the real thing is not actually what people want here, is it?
I think it is, but I think that Brown did say, this great line about I'm whatever it was, but it's just boring. I mean, of course the truth's important, but you've got to make it interesting. I mean, that's fundamental to communication. If I just get up and keep telling you the truth, you just get bored with it. I've got to inspire you and say, well, it's interesting for these reasons. This is why it's good. And you find that key that unlocks somebody's kind of affection for that brand. But you're trying to build affection. You're not just, I'm trying to get you to sort of understand what it is you're saying. You're trying to build affection. And Brown never built that. So not just talking about brands, we're talking about brands now as well, that they have to build affection.
But they're also, I mean, people are bombarded with messages now and information and claims on their time. How do you differentiate the brands you're representing? What methods do you use that are innovative and surprising? Well, I'd like to actually interesting to hear all of you on that one.
Well, ultimately, it's about creativity. Creativity is the most fantastic tool you've got. And I think today, I think the most important thing about today and about technology is that advertising and communication was a rich man's club. It was a club for rich people. Big corporations could afford it. They could afford the entrance price to go on TV, buy newspaper prints, go on posters. I think the big change today is that you no longer need large amounts of money to actually gain attention. What you need is creativity. You need the ability to communicate. And I think that's the most fascinating thing today. And I work with clients, and some of them I'm absolutely appalled at, that they're not innovating in the way they communicate to people. They're not innovating in the opportunities that they've got because they're frightened of it. And I think this is the era of the entrepreneur. The entrepreneur can come along and you can make yourself heard in a way which is unprecedented over the last, whatever. And I think that's the big change today. And that's why I think it's exciting.
Just pick it up with a pop example, if I could, Matt, exactly following that up. I mean, we were hired to do the relaunch of Spandau Ballet a couple of years ago. 80s group, great at the time, da-da-da, hadn't done anything for a long, long, long old time. Lots of groups always coming back, and I thought, well, how are we going to do it? It's all about, as you said, it's about ideas. And we spent 3 or 4 months actually thinking about the ideas. The implementation was quite easy, and we hit on this thing. I wanted an angle. I wanted something which was kind of had a British feel to it. It was very central London, but also there was a deeper sort of resonance of the 80s, and I even wanted to include that sort of vaguely Thatcher, get up and do it yourself type of sort of ethos in there. And it was a complex type of thing because we wanted to hit broadsheets, but also we wanted to hit the Daily Star. Yeah. We wanted everything. So I trawled through the history books, found that they'd done a gig on HMS Belfast in about 1979, and it was a mad gig, and millions of transvestites turned up.
Right back to Blitz days.
And I thought, well, we've got to revisit that. And I had another thought. I thought, hang on, getting newspapers along to a Spandau return might not be that easy. And I thought, HMS Belfast, yes. The Express is 100 yards that way. The Times is 500 yards that way. They're going to, the Sun is over the river. They're going to have to come.
Proximity counts.
And we planned the story in advance, and we worked out the angle, the picture on the top, and then with the big guns, and sort of Tower of London in the background. And then we had the other more serious stories going on where we went back on how they started the whole thing in the late 70s, the punk Malcolm McLaren ethos, do it yourself, make your own T-shirts, form your own band, da-di-da-di-da. And this actually was probably 6 months planning to put it together and ideas. On the day, the other thing I wanted to do was get away from organised things, and I wanted to be deliberately chaotic. We had things going on all over the ships. Everyone seemed to turn up late. There was beer everywhere. It started at 10 in the morning. People were drinking. It never ended until...
This was cash from chaos.
That was the whole point. To do it differently, to take it out of context, to not do it, and to create. And do you know what? We embraced the media, involved the media, embedded them. The result was incredible, and from there on, it did itself, and they sold all the O2s and the rest of it. It was the thinking.
But that was the root of it.
It was the ideas, and as you say, it's the spirit of the entrepreneur. Now, if your client gives you the freedom to do that, you can do great work. If your client ties your hands and just bogs you down in process, you probably end up going round in a circle.
So you've been waiting.
Hello, yes, Guy Phillips in the Internet Advertising Bureau in the UK. My question is mainly for John Hegarty, actually. Hello, it's in the.
I thought it might be.
I used to be a brand advertiser. Talked about brands just then. In the UK, it's a fairly mature medium with 3.5 billion spent online, £1 in 4, etc. And you'd think, well, it must be doing great guns, which it is. But my question is about its credibility as a brand medium. And BBH, you built fame over TV, surely that's your heritage. But whether network agencies actually really do believe it as a brand medium, and how early in the conversations, in their planning conversations, it's considered, or whether actually it's considered as a great response medium at the back end of telly, really.
Well, I think the first thing you have to say, it is relatively new. People are trying to work out how it adds value to a brand, and it will take time. I mean, I think, I wish we'd stop talking about it like that. It is, I mean, people say it isn't a medium. In some ways it is. I think its opportunity, as I've said, is that it's no longer a rich man's club. It's a time when people can find lots of ways of getting an audience and engaging an audience. And I think that's the real advantage of the digital revolution. And I sort of think we should end the debate about them and ask what they're doing. Because I've been around for so long. I remember that debate between television and newspapers, and it was a completely facile debate until they stopped doing it. So stop doing it. Look at the advantages I think the digital world has got, and be selling that and talking about that, and not compare yourself to anything else. I think that's its brilliance.
Philip, one of the things that was interesting during the campaign was that a lot of the standardized, traditional posters were really just the kickoff for them to be mutilated and redesigned online. So you had the situation where both parties were paying a lot of money for traditional posters, images, and so on, and their real impact was precisely the opposite.
We had no money for posters, not a penny.
Yeah.
We didn't have a single poster anywhere.
Well, images then, let's say.
But we did use, obviously, images online. I kind of think that it all made no difference. And that this vast poster campaign maybe didn't make a huge amount of difference. I'm sure that campaigning will go online increasingly, but television did have this huge effect. So I think the two mediums that came through strongly were television and online, which is much stronger than people think. The newspapers just faded away in this campaign, I think. And the image I got was of this, you know, these mums just kind of watching the debates and then on their blooming, and I thought that was really the future. So I guess people will always spend money on posters, but we didn't have any money on posters or any money on polling or any money on vast numbers of things, and we still got away with it. So you learn a lesson
which
there.
leads to another point, which is that one of the lessons of the Labour campaign, if you assume that the party actually didn't end up in that bad a place, 258 could have been a lot worse.
Yes.
What you got for your, the bangs you got for your buck were pretty impressive.
Yes.
Now, for smaller businesses, are there lessons there on how much you can get from a relatively small spend with relatively high impact?
I think there are. I would look at advertising. I'd look at it selectively. But I would certainly look at the whole thing afresh. I mean, Tony Blair always says the first rule of politics is to look at everything anew, and I think you should always be doing that. And that's the lesson for all of us. Look anew the whole time. And when we managed to get away with this with no money, and they had all this money, and it was remarkable how little difference the money seemed to have made.
So in other words, you can't, there's no direct correlation between spend and impact anymore.
In fact, when you get to this kind of position where it all becomes words, 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 and words,
yes.
It gets worse.
Right.
It's like a hamster trapped inside a cage, just going away, more and more and more and more words, and the public is saying, no, I don't want that.
Well, I can see people rolling their hands at me. It's been a fascinating session, and I would like you all to join me in thanking very much our very distinguished panellists, John Hegarty, Alan Edwards, Philip Gould. Thank you.